This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Wyss. Chapter 56. We had been more than an hour under the tree when I heard cries again, but this time I was not alarmed, for I distinguished the voice of the disconsolate mother, and I knew that I could comfort her. Her grief brought her back to the spot where she thought her child had been devoured. She wished, as she afterwards told us, when we could understand her, to search for some remains of him, his hair, his bones, or even a piece of the bark that bound him. And here he was, full of life and health. She advanced slowly, sobbing, and her eyes turned to the ground. She was so absorbed in her search that she did not see us when we were but 20 yards from her. Suddenly, Sophia darted like an arrow to her, took her hand, and said, "Come, Mino is here." Canda neither knew what she saw nor what she heard. She took my daughter for something supernatural, and made no resistance, but followed her to the fig tree. Even then she did not recognize the little creature, released from his bonds, half clothed, covered with flowers, and surrounded by 3 divinities, for she took us for such, and wished to prostrate herself before us. She was still more convinced of it when I took up her son, and placed him in her arms. She recognized him, and the poor little infant held out his arms to her. I can never express to you the transport of the mother. She screamed, clasped her child till he was half suffocated, rapidly repeating words which we could not understand, wept, laughed, and was in a delirium of delight that terrified Minu. He began to cry, and held out his arms to Sophia, who, as well as Matilda, was weeping at the sight. Canda looked at them with astonishment. She soothed the child, and put him to her breast, which he rejected at first, but finally seized it, and his mother was happy. I took the opportunity to try and make her comprehend that the great animal had brought him here, that we had found him and taken care of him, and I made signs for her to follow me, which she did without hesitation, till we reached the grotto, when, without entering, she fled away with her infant with such rapidity that it was impossible to overtake her, and was soon out of sight. I had some difficulty in consoling my daughters for the loss of Minu. They thought they should see him no more, and that his mother was very ungrateful to carry him off, without even letting them take leave of him. They were still weeping and complaining, when we saw the objects of our anxiety approaching. But Canda was now accompanied by a man, who was carrying the child. They entered the grotto, and prostrated themselves before us. You know Parabaquite. His countenance pleased and tranquilized us. As a relation of the king, he was distinguished by wearing a short tunic of leaves. His body was tattooed and stained with various colors, but not his face, which expressed kindness and gratitude, united with great intelligence. He comprehended most of my signs. I did not succeed so well in understanding him, but saw he meant kindly. In the meantime, my daughters had a more intelligible conversation with Canda and Minu. They half devoured the latter with caresses, fed him with figs and honey, and amused him so much that he would scarcely leave them. Canda was not jealous of this preference, but seemed delighted with it. She, in her turn, caressed my daughters, admired their glossy hair and fair skin, and pointed them out to her husband. She repeated Minu after them, but always added another Minu, and appeared to think this name beautiful. After some words with Parabaquite, she placed Minu in Sophia's arms, and they both departed, making signs that they would return, but we did not see them for some time after. Sophia and Matilda had their full enjoyment of their favorite. They wished to teach him to walk and to speak, and they assured me he was making great progress. They were beginning to hope his parents had left him entirely, when they came in sight, Parabaquite bending under the weight of 2 bear skins, and a beautiful piece of matting to close the entrance to my grotto. Kanda carried a basket on her head filled with fine fruit, the cocoa, the breadfruit, which they call rima, pineapples, figs, and finally a piece of bear's flesh roasted at the fire, which I did not like, but I enjoyed the fruits and the milk of the coconut, of which Minu Minu had a good share. They spread the bear skins in the midst of the grotto. Parabaquite, Kanda, and the infant between them took possession of one without ceremony and motioned to us to make our bed of the other. But the bears having only been killed the evening before, these skins had an intolerable smell. I made them comprehend this, and Parabaquite immediately carried them off and placed them in the brook, secured by stones. He brought us in exchange a heap of moss and leaves, on which we slept very well. From this moment we became one family. Kanda remained with us, and repaid to my daughters all the care and affection they bestowed on Minu Minu. There never was a child had more indulgence, but he deserved it for his quickness and docility. At the end of a few months he began to lisp a few words of German, as well as his mother, of whom I was the teacher, and who made rapid progress. Parabaquite was very little with us, but he undertook to be our purveyor, and furnished us abundantly with everything necessary for our subsistence. Kanda taught my daughter to make beautiful baskets. Some, of a flat form, served for our plates and dishes. Parabaquite made us knives from sharp stones. My daughters, in return, taught Kanda to sew. At the time of our shipwreck we had, each of us, in her pocket, a Morocco housewife with a store of needles and thread. By means of these we had mended our linen, and we now made dresses of palm leaves. The bearskins, washed in the stream and thoroughly dried in the burning sun, have been very useful to us in the cold and rainy season. Now that we had guides, we made, in the fine season, excursions to different parts of the island. Minu Minu soon learned to walk, and, being strong, like all these islanders, would always accompany us. We went one day to the seashore. I shuddered at the sight, and Kanda, who knew that my husband and child had perished in the sea, wept with me. We now spoke each other's language well enough to converse. She told me that a black friend, Emily bowed to Mr. Willis, had arrived in a neighboring island to announce to them that there was a being, almighty and all-merciful, who lived in heaven and heard all they said. Her comprehension of this truth was very confused, and I endeavored to make it more clear and positive. "I see very well," said she, "that you know him. Is it to him that you speak every morning and evening, kneeling as we do before our King Bara-Uru?" "Yes, Kanda," said I. "It is before him who is the King of Kings, who gave us our life, who preserves it, and bestows on us all good, and who promises us still more when this life is past." "Was it he who charged you to take care of Minu Minu, and to restore him to me?" asked she. "Yes, Kanda. All that you or I do that is good is put into our hearts by him." I thus tried to prepare the simple mind of Kanda for the great truths that Mr. Willis was to teach her. "You left me little to do," said Mr. Willis. "I found Parabaquite and Kanda prepared to believe, with sincere faith, the holy religion I came to teach. The God of the white people was the only one they adored. I knew Parabaquite. He had come to hunt seals in the island where I was established, and I was struck by his appearance. What was my astonishment to find that when I spoke to him of the one true God, he was no stranger to the subject. He had even some ideas of a Saviour, and of future rewards and punishments. "It was the White Lady," said he, "who taught me this. She teaches Kanda and Minu Minu, whose life she saved, and whom she is bringing up to be good like herself." "I had a great desire," continued Mr. Willis, "to become acquainted with my powerful assistant in the great work of my mission. I told Parabaquite this, who offered to bring me here in his canoe. I came and found, in a miserable cave, or rather in a bear's den, all the virtues of mature age united to the charms of youth, a resigned and pious mother bringing up her children as women should be brought up, in simplicity, forbearance, and love of industry, teaching them as the best knowledge to love God with all their heart and their neighbor as themselves. Under the inspection of their mother, they were educating the son of Pere Bacuite. This child, then 4 years and a half old, spoke German well, and knew his alphabet, which Madame Hertel traced on the floor of the grotto. In this way she taught her daughters to read. They taught Minu Minu, who in his turn teaches his parents. Pere Bacuite often brings his friends to the grotto, and Madame Hertel, having acquired the language, casts into their hearts the good seed, which I venture to hope will not be unfruitful. Finding these people in such a good state, and wishing to enjoy the society of a family like myself banished to a remote region, I decided to take up my abode in this island. Pere Bacuite soon built me a hut in the neighborhood of the grotto. Madame Hertel compelled me to take one of her bearskins. I have by degrees formed my establishment, dividing with my worthy neighbor the few useful articles I brought from Europe, and we live a tranquil and happy life. And now comes the time that brought about our meeting. Some of our islanders in a fishing expedition were driven by the wind on your island. At the entrance of a large bay they found a small canoe of bark, carefully moored to a tree. Either their innate propensity for theft, or the notion that it had no owner prevailed over them, and they brought it away. I was informed of this, and was curious to see it. I recognized at once that it was made by Europeans. The careful finish, the neat form, the oars, rudder, mast, and triangular sail, all showed that it had not been made by savages. The seats of the rowers were made of planks and were painted, and what further convinced me was that I found in it a capital gun, loaded, and a horn of powder in a hole under one of the seats. I then made particular inquiries about the island from whence they had brought the canoe, and all their answers confirmed my idea that it must be inhabited by a European, from whom they had perhaps taken his only means of leaving it. Restless about this fancy, I tried to persuade them to return and discover if the island was inhabited. I could not prevail on them to restore the canoe, but, seeing me much agitated, they resolved secretly to procure me a great pleasure, as they thought, by returning to the island and bringing away any one they could meet with, whether he would or not. Pere Bacuite, always the leader in perilous enterprises, and who was so attached to me, would not be left out in one which was to produce me such pleasure. They set out, and you know the rest of their expedition. I leave it to your wife to tell you how she was brought away, and pass on to the time of their arrival. My people brought them to me in triumph, and were vexed that they had only found one woman and a child, whom I might give to the white lady. This I did promptly. Your wife was ill and distressed, and I carried her immediately to the grotto. There she found a companion who welcomed her with joy. Frances replaced her own lost Alfred, and the two good mothers were soon intimate friends. But, notwithstanding this solace, your Elizabeth was inconsolable at the separation from her husband and children, and terrified at the danger to which you would expose yourself in searching for her. We were even afraid she would lose her reason, when the king came to take away Francis. He had seen him on his arrival, and was much taken with his appearance. He came again to see him, and resolved to adopt him as his son. You know what passed on this subject, and now you are once more united to all those who are dear to you. Bless God, brother, who knows how to produce good from what we think evil, and acknowledge the wisdom of his ways. You must return altogether to your island. I am too much interested in the happiness of Emily to wish to detain her, and if God permits me, when my missions are completed, I will come to end my days with you, and to bless your rising colony. I suppress all our reflections on this interesting history, and our gratitude for the termination of our trials, and hasten to the recital which at my particular entreaty my wife proceeded to give us. End of chapter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Wyss. Chapter 57. My story, she began, will not be long. I might make it in 2 words. You have lost me, and you have found me. I have every reason to thank Heaven for a circumstance which has proved to me how dear I am to you, and has given me the happiness of gaining a friend and 2 dear daughters. Can one complain of an event which has produced such consequences, even though it was attended with some violence? But I ought to do the savages justice. This violence was as gentle as it could be. I need only tell you Père Bacqueté was there to convince you I was well treated, and it was solely the sorrow of being parted from you that affected my health. I shall be well now, and as soon as Jack can walk, I shall be ready to embark for our happy island. I will now tell you how I was brought away. When you and our 3 sons left, to make the tour of the island, I was very comfortable, and you had told me you might return late, or probably not till next day, and when the evening passed away without seeing you, I was not uneasy. Francis was constantly with me. We went together to water the garden, and rested in the Grano Ernestine. Then I returned to the house, took my wheel, and placed myself in my favorite colonnade, where I should be the first to see your return. Francis, seeing me at work, asked if he might go as far as the bridge to meet you, to which I readily consented. He set out, and I was thinking of the pleasure I should have in seeing you again, and hearing you relate your voyage, when I saw Francis running, crying out, "Mamma, mamma! There is a canoe on the sea! I know it is ours! It is full of men, perhaps savages!" "Silly little fellow," said I, "it is your father and brothers. If they are in the canoe, there can be no doubt of it. Your father told me he would bring it, and they would return by water. I had forgotten this when I let you go. Now you can go and meet them on the shore. Give me your arm, and I will go too." And we set off very joyfully to greet our captors. I soon, alas, saw my error. It was indeed our canoe, but instead of my dear ones, there were in it 6 half-naked savages, with terrible countenances, who landed and surrounded us. My blood froze with fright, and if I had wished to flee, I was unable. I fell on the shore, nearly insensible. Still, I heard the cries of my dear Francis, who clung to me, and held me with all his strength. At last my senses quite failed me, and I only recovered to find myself lying at the bottom of the canoe. My son, weeping over me, was trying to recover me, assisted by one of the savages, of less repulsive appearance than his companions, and who seemed the chief. This was Père Bacqueté. He made me swallow a few drops of a detestable fermented liquor, which, however, restored me. I felt, as I recovered, the extent of my disaster, and your grief, my dears, when you should find me missing. I should have been wholly disconsolate, but that Francis was left to me, and he was continually praying me to live for his sake. I received some comfort from a vague notion that as this was our canoe, the savages had already carried you off, and were taking us to you. I was confirmed in this hope when I saw that the savages, instead of making to sea, continued to coast the island till they came to the great bay. I had then no doubt but that we should meet with you, but this hope was soon destroyed. 2 or 3 more of the savages were waiting there on the shore. They spoke to their friends in the canoe, and I understood from their gestures that they were saying they could not find anybody there. I have since learnt from Kanda that part of them landed at the Great Bay, with instructions to search that side of the island for inhabitants, whilst the rest proceeded with the canoe to examine the other side, and had succeeded but too well. The night came on, and they were anxious to return, which, doubtless, prevented them pillaging our house. I believe, moreover, that none of them could have reached Tent House, defended by our strong palisade, and hidden by the rocks among which it is built, and the other party, finding us on the shore, would not penetrate further. When all had entered the canoe, they pushed off, by the light of the stars, into the open sea. I think I must have sunk under my sorrow, but for Francis, and I must confess it, my dear dog Flora, who had never left me. Francis told me that she had tried to defend me, and flew at the savages, but one of them took my apron, tore it, and tied it over her mouth like a muzzle, bound her legs, and then threw her into the canoe, where the poor creature lay at my feet, moaning piteously. She arrived with us in this island, but I have not seen her since. I have often inquired of Pere Bacquete, but he could not tell me what had become of her. "But I know," said Fritz, "and have seen her. We brought Turk with us, and the savages had carried Flora to that desert part of the island, from whence Jack was carried off, so the two dogs met. When I had the misfortune to wound Jack, I quite forgot them. They were rambling off in chase of kangaroos. We left them, and no doubt they are still there. But we must not abandon the poor beasts. If my father will permit me, I will go and seek them in Pere Bacquete's canoe." As we were obliged to wait a few days for Jack's recovery, I consented on condition that Pere Bacquete accompanied them, and the next day was fixed for the expedition. Ernest begged to be of the party, that he might see the beautiful trees and flowers they had described. I then requested the narration might be continued, which had been interrupted by this episode of the two dogs. Francis resumed it where his mother had left off. "We had a favorable passage. The sea was calm, and the boat went so smoothly that both Mamma and I went to sleep. You must have come a much longer way round than necessary, Papa, as your voyage lasted 3 days, and we arrived here the day after our departure. Mamma was then awake, and wept constantly, believing she should never more see you or my brothers. Pere Bacquete seemed very sorry for her, and tried to console her. At last he addressed to her 2 or 3 words of German, pointing to heaven. His words were very plain: Almighty God, good, and then Black Friend, and White Lady, adding the words Kanda, Bear, and Minu Minu. We did not understand what he meant, but he seemed so pleased at speaking these words that we could not but be pleased too, and to hear him name God in German gave us confidence, though we could not comprehend where or how he had learnt the words. Perhaps, said Mamma, he has seen your papa and brothers. I thought so too. Still it appeared strange that in so short a time he could acquire and remember these words. However it might be, Mamma was delighted to have him near her, and taught him to pronounce the words father, mother, and son, which did not seem strange to him, and he soon knew them. She pointed to me and to herself as she pronounced the words, and he readily comprehended them, and said to us, with bursts of laughter, showing its large ivory teeth, Kanda, mother, Minu Minu, son, Pere Bacquete, father, White Lady, mother. Mamma thought he referred to her, but it was to Madame Emily. He tried to pronounce this name and 2 others, but could not succeed. At last he said, Girls, girls, and almost convinced us he must know some Europeans, which was a great comfort to us. When I saw Mamma more composed, I took out my flageolet to amuse her, and played the air to Ernest's verses. This made her weep again very much, and she begged me to desist. The savages, however, wished me to continue, and I did not know whom to obey. I changed the air, playing the merriest I knew. They were in ecstasies. They took me in their arms one after the other, saying, "Bara Uru! Bara Uru!" I repeated the word after them, and they were still more delighted. But Mamma was so uneasy to see me in their arms that I broke from them and returned to her. At last we landed. They carried Mamma, who was too weak to walk. About 100 yards from the shore we saw a large building of wood and reeds, before which was a crowd of savages. One who was very tall came to receive us. He was dressed in a short tunic, much ornamented, and wore a necklace of pierced shells. He was a little disfigured by a white bone passed through his nostrils. But you saw him, Papa, when he wanted to adopt me. It was Bara Uru, the king of the island. I was presented to him, and he was pleased with me, touched the end of my nose with his, and admired my hair very much. My conductors ordered me to play on the flageolet. I played some lively German airs, which made them dance and leap, till the king fell down with fatigue, and made a sign for me to desist. He then spoke for some time to the savages, who stood in a circle round him. He looked at Mamma, who was seated in a corner near her protector Parabaquite. He called the latter, who obliged Mamma to rise, and presented her to the king. Bara Uru looked only at the red and yellow India handkerchief which she wore on her head. He took it off very unceremoniously, and put it on his own head, saying "Miti," which means beautiful. He then made us re-embark in the canoe with him, amusing himself with me and my flageolet, which he attempted to play by blowing it through his nose, but did not succeed. After turning round a point which seemed to divide the island into two, we landed on a sandy beach. Parabaquite and another savage proceeded into the interior, carrying my mother, and we followed. We arrived at a hut similar to the king's, but not so large. There we were received by Mr. Wyss, whom we judged to be the Black Friend, and from that time we had no more fears. He took us under his protection, first speaking to the king and to Parabaquite in their own language. He then addressed Mamma in German, mixed with a few English words, which we understood very well. He knew nothing of you and my brothers, but, from what Mamma told him, he promised to have you sought for and brought as soon as possible to the island. In the meantime, he offered to lead us to a friend who would take care of us and nurse poor Mamma, who looked very ill. She was obliged to be carried to the grotto, but after that her cares were over, and her pleasure without alloy, for the Black Friend had promised to seek you. The White Lady received us like old friends, and Sophia and Matilda took me at first for their own brother, and still love me as if I was. We only wish for you all. Madame Mimi made Mamma lie down on the bearskin, and prepared her a pleasant beverage from the milk of the coconut. Sophia and Matilda took me to gather strawberries and figs and beautiful flowers, and we caught fish in the brook between two osier hurdles. We amused ourselves very well with Minu Minu, while Canda and Madame Emily amused Mamma. The king came the next day to see his little favorite. He wished me to go with him to another part of the island, where he often went to hunt, but I would not leave Mamma and my new friends. I was wrong, Papa, for you were there, and my brothers. It was there Jack was wounded and brought away. I might have prevented all that, and you would then have returned to us. How sorry I have been for my obstinacy! It was I more than Fritz who was the cause of his being wounded. Bara Uru returned in the evening to the grotto, and think, Papa, of our surprise, our delight, and our distress, when he brought us poor Jack, wounded and in great pain, but still all joy at finding us again. The king told Mr. Wyss he was sure Jack was my brother, and he made us a present of him, adding that he gave him in exchange for Mamma's handkerchief. Mamma thanked him earnestly, and placed Jack beside her. From him she learnt all you had done to discover us. He informed Mr. Wyss where he had left you, and he promised to seek and bring you to us. He then examined the wound, which Jack wished him to think he had himself caused with Fritz's gun, but this was not probable, as the ball had entered behind and lodged in the shoulder. Mr. Wyss extracted it with some difficulty, and poor Jack suffered a good deal, but all is now going on well. What a large party we shall be, Papa, when we are all settled in our island. Sophia and Matilda, Minu, Kanda, Parabaquite, you, Papa, and 2 mammas, and Mr. Wyss. My wife smiled as the little orator concluded. Mr. Wyss then dressed Jack's wound, and thought he might be removed in 5 or 6 days. "Now, my dear Jack," said I, "it is your turn to relate your history. Your brother left off where you were entertaining the savages with your buffooneries, and certainly they were never better introduced. But how did they suddenly think of carrying you away?"
"Parabaquite told me," said Jack, "that they were struck with my resemblance to Francis as soon as I took my flageolet. After I played a minute or two, the savage who wore mamma's handkerchief, whom I now know to be the king, interrupted me by crying out and clapping his hands. He spoke earnestly to the others, pointing to my face and to my flageolet, which he had taken. He looked also at my jacket of blue cotton, which one of them had tied round his shoulders like a mantle, and doubtless he then gave orders for me to be carried to the canoe. They seized upon me. I screamed like a madman, kicked them and scratched them, but what could I do against 7 or 8 great savages? They tied my legs together, and my hands behind me, and carried me like a parcel. I could then do nothing but cry out for Fritz, and the night of the gun came rather too soon. In attempting to defend me, some way or another, off went his gun, and the ball took up its abode in my shoulder. I can assure you an unpleasant visitor is that same ball, but here he is, the scoundrel. Father Willis pulled him out by the same door as that by which he went in, and since his departure all goes on well. Now for my story. When poor Fritz saw that I was wounded, he fell down as if he had been shot at the same time. The savages, thinking he was dead, took away his gun and carried me into the canoe. I was in despair more for the death of my brother than from my wound, which I almost forgot, and was wishing they would throw me into the sea, when I saw Fritz running at full speed to the shore, but we pushed off, and I could only call out some words of consolation. The savages were very kind to me, and one of them held me up seated on the outrigger. They washed my wound with sea water, sucked it, tore my pocket handkerchief to make a bandage, and as soon as we landed, squeezed the juice of some herb into it. We sailed very quickly, and passed the place where we had landed in the morning. I knew it again, and could see Ernest standing on a sandbank. He was watching us, and I held out my arms to him. I thought I also saw you, Papa, and heard you call, but the savages yelled, and though I cried with all my strength, it was in vain. I little thought they were taking me to mamma. As soon as we had disembarked, they brought me to this grotto, and I thought I must have died of surprise and joy when I was met by mamma and Francis, and then by Sophia, Matilda, Mamma Emily, and Mr. Wyss, who was a second father to me. This is the end of my story, and a very pretty end it is, that brings us all together. What matters it to have had a little vexation for all this pleasure? I owe it all to you, Fritz. If you had let me sink to the bottom of the sea, instead of dragging me out by the hair, I should not have been here so happy as I am. I'm obliged to the gun, too. Thanks to it, I was the first to reach mamma and see our new friends. The next day, Fritz and Ernest set out on their expedition with Parabaquite in his canoe, to seek our 2 valued dogs. The good islander carried his canoe on his back to the shore. I saw them set off, but not without some dread, in such a frail bark, into which the water leaked through every seam. But my boys could swim well, and the kind, skilful, and bold Parabaquite undertook to answer for their safety. I therefore recommended them to God, and returned to the grotto, to tranquillize my wife's fears. Jack was inconsolable that he could not form one of the party, but Sophia scolded him for wishing to leave them to go upon the sea which had swallowed up poor Alfred. In the evening we had the pleasure of seeing our brave dogs enter the grotto. They leaped on us in a way that terrified the poor little girls at first, who took them for bears, but they were soon reconciled to them when they saw them fawn round us, lick our hands, and pass from one to the other to be caressed. My sons had had no difficulty in finding them. They had run to them at the first call, and seemed delighted to see their masters again. The poor animals had subsisted on the remains of the kangaroos, but apparently had met with no fresh water, for they seemed dying with thirst, and rushed to the brook as soon as they discovered it, and returned again and again. Then they followed us to the hut of the good missionary, who had been engaged all day in visiting the dwellings of the natives and teaching them the truths of religion. I had accompanied him, but, from ignorance of the language, could not aid him. I was, however, delighted with the simple and earnest manner in which he spoke, and the eagerness with which they heard him. He finished by a prayer, kneeling, and they all imitated him, lifting up their hands and eyes to heaven. He told me he was trying to make them celebrate the Sunday. He assembled them in his tent, which he wished to make a temple for the worship of the true God. He intended to consecrate it for this purpose, and to live in the grotto after our departure. The day arrived at last. Jack's shoulder was nearly healed, and my wife, along with her happiness, recovered her strength. The pinnace had been so well guarded by Parabaquite and his friends that it suffered no injury. I distributed among the islanders everything I had that could please them, and made Parabaquite invite them to come and see us in our island, requesting we might live on friendly terms. Mr. Wyss wished much to see it, and to complete our happiness he promised to accompany and spend some days with us, and Parabaquite said he would take him back when he wished it. We embarked then, after taking leave of Barauru, who was very liberal in his presents, giving us, besides fruits of every kind, a whole hog roasted, which was excellent. We were 14 in number, 16 reckoning the 2 dogs. The missionary accompanied us, and a young islander, whom Parabaquite had procured to be his servant, as he was too old and too much occupied with his mission to attend to his own wants. This youth was of a good disposition and much attached to him. Parabaquite took him to assist in rowing when he returned. Emily could not but feel rather affected at leaving the grotto, where she had passed 4 tranquil, if not happy, years, fulfilling the duties of a mother. Neither could she avoid a painful sensation when she once more saw the sea that had been so fatal to her husband and son. She could scarcely subdue the fear she had of trusting all she had left to that treacherous element. She held her daughters in her arms, and prayed for the protection of heaven. Mr. Wyss and I spoke to her of the goodness of God, and pointed out to her the calmness of the water, the security of the pinnace, and the favorable state of the wind. My wife described to her our establishment, and promised her a far more beautiful grotto than the one she had left, and at last she became more reconciled. After 7 or 8 hours' voyage, we arrived at Cape Disappointment, and we agreed the bay should henceforth be called the Bay of the Happy Return. The distance to Tent House from hence was much too great for the ladies and children to go on foot. My intention was to take them by water to the other end of the island, near our house, but my elder sons had begged to be landed at the bay, to seek their livestock and take them home. I left them there with Parabaquite. Jack recommended his buffalo to them, and Francis's bull, and all were found. We coasted the island, arrived at Safety Bay, and were soon at Tent House, where we found all, as we had left it, in good condition. Notwithstanding the description my wife had given them, our new guests found our establishment far, far beyond their expectation. With what delight Jack and Francis ran up and down the colonnade with their young friends! What stories they had to tell of all the surprises they had prepared for their mother! They showed them Fritzia, Jackia, the Franciade, and gave their friends water from their beautiful fountain. Absence seemed to have improved everything, and I must confess I had some difficulty to refrain from demonstrating my joy as wildly as my children. Minu Minu, Parabaquite, and Kanda were lost in admiration, calling out continually, "Miti! Beautiful!" My wife was busied in arranging a temporary lodging for our guests. The workroom was given up to Mr. Willis. My wife and Madame Emily had our apartment, the two little girls being with them, to whom the hammocks of the elder boys were appropriated. Kanda, who knew nothing about beds, was wonderfully comfortable on the carpet. Fritz, Ernest, and the two natives stowed themselves wherever they wished, in the colonnade or in the kitchen, all was alike to them. I slept on moss and cotton in Mr. Willis's room, with my two younger sons. Every one was content, waiting till our ulterior arrangements were completed. End of chapter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Wyss. The Conclusion. I must conclude my journal here. We can scarcely be more happy than we are, and I feel no cares about my children. Fritz is so fond of the chase and of mechanics, and Ernest of study, that they will not wish to marry, but I please myself by hoping at some time to see my dear Jack and Francis happily united to Sophia and Matilda. What remains for me to tell? The details of happiness, however sweet in enjoyment, are often tedious in recital. I will only add that after passing a few days with us, Mr. Willis returned to his charge, promising to visit us, and eventually to join us. The Grotto Ernestine, fitted up by Fritz and Parabaquite, made a pretty abode for Madame Hertel and her daughters, and the two islanders. Minu Minu did not leave his young mammas, and was very useful to them. I must state, also, that my son Ernest, without abandoning the study of natural history, applied himself to astronomy, and mounted the large telescope belonging to the ship. He acquired considerable knowledge of this sublime science, which his mother, however, considered somewhat useless. The course of the other planets did not interest her, so long as all went on well in that which she inhabited, and nothing now was wanting to her happiness, surrounded as she was by friends. The following year we had a visit from a Russian vessel, the Neva, commanded by Captain Krusenstern, a countryman and distant relation of mine. The celebrated Horner of Zurich accompanied him as astronomer. Having read the first part of our journal, sent into Europe by Captain Johnson, he had come purposely to see us. Delighted with our establishment, he did not advise us to quit it. Captain Krusenstern invited us to take a passage in his vessel. We declined his offer, but my wife, though she renounced her country for ever, was glad of the opportunity of making inquiries about her relations and friends. As she had concluded, her good mother had died some years before, blessing her absent children. My wife shed some tears, but was consoled by the certainty of her mother's eternal felicity and the hope of their meeting in futurity. One of her brothers was also dead. He had left a daughter, to whom my wife had always been attached, though she was very young when we left. Henrietta Bodmer was now 16, and, Mr. Horner assured us, a most amiable girl. My wife wished much to have her with us. Ernest would not leave Mr. Horner a moment, he was so delighted to meet with one so eminently skilful in his favourite science. Astronomy made them such friends that Mr. Horner petitioned me to allow him to take my son to Europe, promising to bring him back himself in a few years. This was a great trial to us, but I felt that his taste for science required a larger field than our island. His mother was reluctant to part with him, but consoled herself with the notion that he might bring his cousin Henrietta back with him. Many tears were shed at our parting. Indeed, the grief of his mother was so intense that my son seemed almost inclined to give up his inclination, but Mr. Horner made some observations about the transit of Venus so interesting that Ernest could not resist. He left us, promising to bring us back everything we wished for. In the meantime, Captain Krusenstern left us a good supply of powder, provisions, seeds, and some capital tools, to the great delight of Fritz and Jack. They regretted their brother greatly, but diverted their minds from sorrow by application to mechanics, assisted by the intelligent Parabaquete. They have already succeeded in constructing, near the cascade, a corn-mill and a saw-mill, and have built a very good oven. We miss Ernest very much. Though his taste for study withdrew him a good deal from us, and he was not so useful as his brothers, we found his calm and considerate advice often of value, and his mildness always spread a charm over our circle, in joy or in trouble. Except this little affliction, we were very happy. Our labors are divided regularly. Fritz and Jack manage the Board of Works. They have opened a passage through the rock which divided us from the other side of the island, thus doubling our domain and our riches. At the same time, they formed a dwelling for Madame Hertel near our own, from the same excavation in the rock. Fritz took great pains with it. The windows are made of oiled paper instead of glass, but we usually assemble in our large workroom, which is very well lighted. Francis has the charge of our flocks and of the poultry, all greatly increased. For me, I preside over the grand work of agriculture. The two mothers, their two daughters, and Canda manage the garden, spin, weave, take care of our clothes, and attend to household matters. Thus we all work, and everything prospers. Several families of the natives, pupils of Mr. Wyss, have obtained leave through him to join us, and are settled at Falcon's Nest and at the farm. These people assist us in the cultivation of our ground, and our dear missionary in the cultivation of our souls. Nothing is wanting to complete our happiness but the return of dear Ernest. End of the conclusion, and now on to a postscript written 2 years after. We are now as happy as we can desire. Our son is returned. According to my wishes, he had made out Captain Johnson and Lieutenant Bell, our first visitors, whom the storm had driven from us, but who were still determined to see us again. My son found them preparing for another voyage to the South Seas. He at once seized the opportunity of accompanying them, impatiently desirous to revisit the island, and to bring to us Henrietta Bodmer, now become his wife. She is a simple, amiable Swiss girl, who suits us well, and who is delighted to see once more her kind aunt, now become her mother. My wife is overjoyed. This is her first daughter-in-law, but Jack and Francis, as well as Sophia and Matilda, are growing up. And moreover, my dear wife, who has great ideas of married happiness, hopes to induce Emily to consent to be united to Fritz at the same time as her daughters are married. Fritz would feel all the value of this change. His character is already softened by her society, and though she is a few years older than he is, she is blessed with all the vivacity of youth. Mr. Wyss approves of this union, and we hope he will live to solemnize the 3 marriages. Ernest and Henrietta inhabit the Grotto Ernestine, which his brothers fitted up as a very tasteful dwelling. They had even, to gratify their brother, raised on the rock above the grotto a sort of observatory, where the telescope is mounted, to enable him to make his astronomical observations. Yet I perceive his passion for exploring distant planets is less strong, since he has so much to attach him to this. I give this conclusion of my journal to Captain Johnson, to take into Europe, to be added to the former part. If any one of my readers be anxious for further particulars respecting our colony and our mode of life, let him set out for the happy island. He will be warmly welcomed,
and may join with us in earnest chorus, which we now sing with additional pleasure. All we love around us smile, joyful is our desert isle. End of the postscript. End of the book. Thank you for listening.